In the name of the one and only, we are here, at least on the surface of it, because we decided that most decisions are made somewhere else, high up above our level of authority and beyond our reach, in which we acknowledge God as consciousness, not simply a creator, but God is the source of creation itself. It's not he or she, as genders are reflections of human perception. It is probably more appropriate that it is not independent of you. It is the totality of everything. So when I call myself God, according to a thinker of about 1,000 years ago, when I call myself God, I am not talking about my personal self. I am talking about the expression of the God self that rests inside of me. The verb, the energy, not the noun. Once you think God is a noun, person, place, or thing, you separate yourself from it and immediately become a limited being. That's what separates the believer, in terms of religious tradition, from the knower in a spiritual tradition. The discussion we have today is about Ibn Sina as an architect of the Islamic civilization. I'm not that much interested in his biographical background, which is fine, but I think what is more important is what made him who he became, not where he came from, or who he was in the physical. But I do have to hint at least a little bit so you understand Ibn Sina in contrast to the other thinkers that we will be talking about later. His father was from Balkh in modern Afghanistan. His mother was from Bukhara in modern Uzbekistan. He lived in Central Asia at large, and I think if we look at his life, just like his thoughts, he spread all over that region at least. His physical life was restless because of all the turmoils he faced. There were political turmoils because the Ghaznavids of Afghanistan were challenging the Abbasids in Baghdad. And each one was trying to brag, to have the bragging right of having a more richer court in terms of having more scholars and more thinkers. There was also a philosophical divide or turmoil in which Islam came up with ideas to present God through a different perspective, not just the one God, but the God of the oneness of being in the context of Wahdaniyah, which means all things are God. This was not easy for the traditionalists to believe, but it attracted the philosophical bunch. And so it brought the question as to whether we can blend Greek philosophy, and when I say Greek, it's not necessarily Greek per se, but that's how it's understood. Every civilization had its philosophy, and in philosophical thought, there is so much commonality that it's a shame we put cultural labels on them. But just for the convenience of conversation, between the Greek philosophy on the one hand and religious tradition on the other, as to which is the best way to reach God, to understand God. Then there was also a turmoil within sciences themselves, and those were the turmoils where positivist philosophy was separating from the traditional philosophy. Whether, here again, the question was whether the supremacy of science over philosophy should be adhered to, or the other way around. So again, scholars differ on this too. And to add to that, the actual life of Ibn Sina, where he was liked by some, loved by others, but hated perhaps, or at least disliked by others. So he had to, in many cases, had to run for his life. And from Balkh to Bukhara, and from Gorganj to Gorgan, and from Heshmadan to Hamadan, from place to place, just to survive. And so it's interesting to see that knowledge can be liability when it's politicized, or at least when politicians want to manipulate it for their own interests. Ibn Sina studied the Quran by the age of 8 and went to sciences, and I'm talking about hardcore sciences of his time, mathematics, physics and all that, and finished everything by the age of 18. Now, however we designate degrees of education like PhDs and all that, he had it earlier than perhaps anyone that I know. So he was a genius in that sense. But as he had confessed later in life, he said he did not learn anything after the age 18. That the formal education is what set him for an adventure. And that adventure was that he was trying to question the concepts and create things within rather than absorbing them from without. Not in the sense of trying to have a preference, but that sometimes when you are so busy thinking, and when I'm using the word thinking, I'm talking about deep thinking, not the thinking like what's for lunch and where did I put the thing in the refrigerator, not that thinking, the deep thinking. So these deep thinkings preoccupied him so deeply that he had to go to the works of another great philosopher by the name of Abu Nasr al-Farabi, who was also from, at least in current geography, from northern Afghanistan or some part of Central Asia. I don't like to impose modern identities, especially political ones, on people who are beyond being identified politically. And he studied his work and found out that Abu Nasr al-Farabi, that the Latins called Al-Farabios, because they wanted to Latinize the words so they would become less offensive, seeing them come from a different culture, from the enemy territory, so to say. And he found out that Farabi was making headways into bridging the Greek thought with Islam. Islam is perhaps the most rational of the monotheistic traditions. So reasoning was not strange to Islam. And Farabi got the title of having the second teacher after Plato, Plato being the first one. I don't know why Socrates was missed from the equation. So Ibn Sina worked on his thoughts. And then Al-Farabi's emphasis was on creating the Al-Madinah al-Fazila, which is what the Prophet created in a city called Yathrib. In case you forgot that, the roots of the Islamic civilization were etymologically established in Medina, from which Madaniya or Madaniyat comes. So Islam from the start had its spiritual beginning in the Mount of Hira, the traditional beginning in the Kaaba, and the civilizational beginning in Medina. Let me also quickly take you through some of his works, this great genius. One was Al-Shifa, the Book of Remedy. And in those days, sciences were not dissected, so you could become one or that. You had to become everything. And then he had the Najat, the Book of Deliverance, which is a summary of the Shifa. Uyun al-Hikmah, Fountains of Wisdom. And a total of 240 books and treatises, some of which survived, but not all. But in terms of the cross-reference in his existing work, it appears that he had to have been writing with such depth that, take the word, the Qanun that he wrote. Interesting, the word Qanun, which means the law, is about medicine, and the word Shifa, which is about medicine, is about law. But that's Ibn Sina for you. So let me go to cut through a lot of this introductory things that I thought I would have about 5 hours for discussing it, but we don't. Okay. The discussion I am going to have today, the theme would be how Ibn Sina was able to bridge the gap between philosophy and religion. Because before that, you took one or the other road, not both. Because religion is a matter of conviction and of revelation, whereas philosophy is a matter of revealing things to yourself from within you through reason. And that's why the title on reasoning the divine, that if you want to understand God through conviction, you can go to the Quran. And here the idea is not that we are leaving the Quran, not at all. We are trying to understand Quran through reasoning it, and in that sense, Ibn Sina reformulates the tenets of Greek philosophy in terms of monotheistic, monotheism. So it's this blending which resulted in the creation of a new school of philosophy, the peripatetic or the Mashai school, which comes from the word ash'a. For those of you who speak Arabic, it's the light or the rays that emit and lights up all the dark corners. So therefore the idea was that through light one must find the truth in all dark corners of either the physical world, but more importantly through your own perceptions. And our perceptions do get dark sometimes when we don't pay the bills. Which is the nama that God is asking us if we are grateful to His greatest gift, which is our brain power. We better use it. But most of us are in the habit of keeping it dormant. And that results in the greatest kufr. I don't know, something happens when I'm on the stage. And if the kufr is the covering of the truth, how do you cover the truth? When you become dormant, when you don't use your brain, you deny yourself the knowledge. All the knowledge does not need to come from outside. So, Ibn Sina's approach to bridging this gap and in the understanding of God had to be based on ontology, which is the science of the studying of being. I'm going to be using very heavy words here, but please don't think that I understand them. I'm just sharing my own speculations, and if I confuse you, that's by design, and if you learn, that is your virtue. So let's take up with that idea that in the physical and in the metaphysical, which we have to blur the borders, there are two ways of talking about entities, things. One is mahiya, one of my favorite Arabic words, in which ma is the negation and the emphasis and the exclusion and exception. But here is the being, which would translate as mahiya would translate as it is not but that which it is. In other words, the very essence of it. And if we tap onto Latin language, the essence comes from the word es. For those of you who understand French, Portuguese, no, Persian, it's like the word ast, the beingness of something. And so mahiya is the essence in need of existence. And that's why the second part of the mahiya would be called the being or the existence of the truth of a thing. To illustrate it through an example, if I say the word flower, what comes to mind? Okay, now that is the mahiya. We all know what flower is, right? But does flower exist here? No. And except the one in Iman's hair. But if we bring a flower, hopefully it's not cut, it's in a pot, and hold it in front of you, then you can see that is the flower. So you don't even have to explain it or name it. So that will be the existence of it. But before you saw the flower, it existed here. And that was the mahiya. So we work between the essence of something and the existence of something. So God, therefore, is essence and being in the same. For everything else, they are different. You can think of a flower without the flower being here. So because its existence was separate, as I gave you the example. Whereas in God, both the existence and the being is the same. And then comes the next element. That is the necessity of it in the human thought. So the difference would be that other than God is that the essence and the beings are not the same. They are different. They are here, they are not there. And that raises the question of the possibility. Whether something is possible or not. For instance, you can say a horse, and all of you would be thinking of a particular horse, and it's possible that for that horse in your imagination to be black, white, gray, whatever color. But if I say a three-legged horse or a five-legged horse, now we are talking about an impossibility. You can perceive it if you want to, but you cannot produce it, and therefore a five-legged horse cannot have existence. Whereas the concept of horse, we do have that. So this creates a set of terminologies that Ibn Sina uses. One is the imtina, in Arabic, the improbability of things, like the five-legged horse. What happened to the three-legged one? Never mind.
They exist.
No, they don't.
The three ones, yes.
Only in your imagination, which will bring it to the Mahiyya. So the three-legged exists in the Mahiyya, the four-legged exists in Mahiyya and in the physical. So the first one is the imtina, improbability. The second one is the imkan, the possibility. And probability and possibilities are not the same. And the third concept is wujub, the necessity. Wajib al-wujub. And so when you put these three elements together in the definition or an understanding of God according to Ibn Sina, God is the necessary being. Not only is God's essence and existence one and the same, but it has to exist. It has to have the necessity for its existence. In other words, you can't use that as an improbability. Whereas other things other than God could be either a mumtane or mumkin, possible or impossible. Those things for other things could happen. Now, in the universe, all things are possible beings. In other words, the possibility for things exists, and metaphysically they are either contingent or accidents. So what is the possible being? The possible being would be that which is eternal and permanent. And Ibn Sina is using the term angel for that they are permanent. And then the impermanent ones would be the temporal and the transient, like we human beings, if not you, certainly me. And this gives us the next set of definitions, which is, again, in terms of separating those two, we did talk about the flower having existence or non-existence, having the mahiyya or having the wujud. But then we talk about the substance in quiddity. And in the substance, let's talk back about the same flower. If I say red flower, what part of it is the substance? The color is not the substance. Why? Because color in itself cannot exist unless it exists as part of something else. But the flower itself does. So the flower petal has existence, and it has essence, and it has one more thing. Yeah, it has substance. Whereas the color of the flower may have, the color of the flower would have essence, it would have existence, but it does not have substance unless it becomes part of something else. How am I doing in terms of confusing you? I'm headed there. So don't worry, but if by the end of the talk you're as confused as I am, then the aim is achieved. So let's go to the substance now. Substance has three forms, or it's of three kinds. One is the intellect. That's aql, the consciousness. The other is the soul, the nafs. And the third is the body, or the jism. Now, aql is divorce from matter and potentiality. Okay? The consciousness itself does not have matter, because it doesn't have form, nor does it have potentiality of becoming one or another. Nafs, on the other hand, is divorced from matter, but it needs a body to act. Forget about the ghost movies in Hollywood. Okay, that gives you an idea that the only way you can see that they have to have a form. Our own soul. I look in the mirror every morning. I don't see it. It's just the same face that keeps turning nicer and more handsome every day. But nafs would have to have that body to act through. And the third one is the body itself, which accepts divisibility and dimensionality. In other words, it has to be long, short, whatever. And I'm not talking about myself. Now, so in this case, these three elements, when it is the emanation from the divine, it comes in that order. What was the first one? Aql, consciousness. The second one, soul. The third one, the body. Now, from a human perspective, it is in the exact reverse. So the Quran is talking about this in the reverse order. God created first Adam, the body of the human body, خلق الإنسان, right? So first the form of the body was created, then God blew into it nafkha, the spirit of God, that becomes the soul. So now, it's moving around, just to make sure that detectors don't identify it as non-living. So it comes to life. Then comes the third element, and the third element is the aql. It starts thinking. Okay, it starts reasoning. So the order is reversed because of where we are. Now, take these three elements of the aql, jism, and nafs. When you think about it in religious terms, it has its own domain. And that's why the Greek thought and religious traditions were going their own separate ways. And here is the genius of Ibn Sina, that I think, and I could be wrong on this like in so many other things, is that he took the three concepts of the Greek thought, which are mythos, eros, and logos. And if that sounds too Greek, let me explain them. Mythos is a myth or a mythology. It's a traditional or a recurrent narrative. It's a story. And eros is the god of love. It's the emotions, or the Arabic word atifa. And in Jungian psychology, that would be the principle of personal relatedness in human activities, not for business. But it's associated more with the anima and the animus. And it's the third one would be logos, which is the Greek word for word, okay, or reason. And it's from the word logos you get logic, for instance. And that, to use the terminologies of Christian thought, for instance, it's the Word of God. That would be the logos, or the principle of divine reason and creative order. Now, I think that Ibn Sina uses these three principles, and they can combine them. He combines them together. The mythos, the narrative, is the story. The story of the creation of humans, or the creation of Adam, and those two are different things in the Quran. Okay? خلق الإنسان, that goes on one part, and then Adam comes with a ja'ala verb, a different thing. But that's a narrative, it's a story. So Quran is not a novel to tell a story, but the story is the vessel for carrying the concept. Because in narrative writing, for those of you who are English majors, in narrative writing, the good thing of narration is that it put things in order, generally a chronological order. And because we think in terms of time in a linear form, things fall into place. So that is there. Then comes the question of the logos, which I think is the the one for reasoning, the consciousness, and the eros will give that to the soul. So how are these put together? Like I was there, but just an interpretation. The way all these things are put together, I think, in a way, Ibn Sina is trying to explain. That's my interpretation. I think he's explaining an ayah, or rather a smaller part of an ayah. And that is the one that we often recite more as a slogan than as an understanding. And it's probably the one ayah that's the least understood and the least thought about, because we use it as a formality. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. How often do we see that? How often do we say it? And do we really care? It's a formality. Someone loses someone and we just remind them, we are all going there. I mean, like, they don't know? Of course they do. So, if we are from God, how did we come from God? And if we are going back to God, how are we going back to God? Here is where I put those concepts together. They are color coordinated to make them look nice. They go together. So the body part goes with the mythos, the creation of Adam, and the myth that we have. The soul part is the nafs, which goes with the God of love. Now, we oftentimes use the word nafs in a negative sense, but it doesn't have to be. It depends on how you charge it, negative or positive, right? Electrons, neutrons, protons. Okay. That goes for the soul part of it. And the third part of it is the intellect, or the aql, which is the word or the reasoning. In the Greek thought, God is part of the creation. And therefore, if you have to prove its existence, you have to use the same tools. Whereas our brain power and our senses have no capacity for that. The difference would be understood in using, again, two Arabic words. That God is alim, right? Knowing and knower. And the opposite of that will be ma'lum. Okay, that which becomes known. So if God knows us, God is the subject, God becomes the alim, and we become the ma'lum. Now, if you reverse that, okay, when we try to become the alims, okay, what becomes the ma'lum? God cannot become the ma'lum because God cannot become the subject. Sorry, God cannot become the object in this case, in grammatical terms, and God cannot become the subject in terms of the general terminology. So the reason God is not ma'lum is because it needs a alim that is not us, because we're not equipped. Now, if that is the case, then the Islamic thought, God is not part of the universe itself, but it's above it. And so therefore all those terms, oh wonderful, okay. So therefore all those terms would make sense in the following way. Now, let's look at this chart. Let me explain, just like in the argument, let me explain the terms. This triangle here is intellect, down at the bottom. That's aql. I'm sure you haven't seen aql, but if you see it, it will appear just like that. Now, the circle is sphere. It's heaven. Heaven is a level of reality. but it's also soul, because it has to have, remember, the soul needs the body for it to manifest. Now, on this side here, I don't know if you can make these bigger, any bigger? Oh, sorry. Okay, so the thin arrow, the one that's on diet, that means generate. The double arrow, the thick one that is not going to the gym, that is the contemplation. Okay? Now I know nothing makes sense at this point. It will be the same later, but anyway. So, let me point them here. Contemplation, generation, intellect, and the sphere or heavens plus the soul. Now, in the context of all reality, we are talking about possibility, probability, and all the things we talked about here. God is way up at the top. Remember, we talked about the oneness of essence and of existence. So God becomes the necessary being. That term is Ibn Sina's. The Arabic equivalent is wajib al-wujud, that it has to exist in and of itself without anything. Because in the Greek thought, the existence is often explained in terms of causality. So the closest the Greeks would get to the concept of God would be that God is, everything is caused by something else. You follow that chain, that which caused the first thing is the first cause, or the cause of causes, or the uncaused cause. That's the philosophical definition of God in Greek thought. The uncaused cause. Now, Ibn Sina says that causality is irrelevant to the existence of God. It's just totally irrelevant. You can argue it if you want to. But that God is above that because its existence is a necessity. It's the element of necessity that he introduces. So God is the necessary being. Then, at some point in time, God wills, decides to create. Okay? Now, we have Quranic reference for all of this, and I'll leave that just for the interest of time. That when God decides to create, and we understand God as beauty, and God doesn't create out of necessity, because if God needs something, then it's not much of a God, is it? So why does God create? Well, that why is not for questioning it. It's for understanding it. God creates because the beauty that God is needs to be reflected in something. That's why beautiful and handsome people look in the mirror. I try hard, it doesn't work. So what is the mirror? The creation, the manifestation is the mirror of God. When we see all the beauty in nature, that is the beauty of God. Why is it beauty? Because God created us with senses, such as those, the eye, smell and all that, to understand what is beautiful. And then God creates that which is beautiful. In other words, beauty is created between our eyes and the object it sees. Between our ears and, say, the music we hear. Between our nose and the things we smell. In other words, it's part of that interactive thing. So God creates a mirror for its beauty. And one of the best mirrors, this is very prejudiced, is the human heart. The human heart is the mirror in which God's beauty reflects. So at that point, which was a long time ago, I don't remember, when God creates, he creates, again, using the Greek logic, is that which is one creates one. So what did God create? Remember the order? From there. What was the first thing that God created?
The body.
The aql, the consciousness. So the first emanation from that necessary being is that first triangle, which is the intellect. Now, this intellect is then doing several things. One, it contemplates back on God. I don't know if you have, yeah, here. See that the arrow goes back. So the first intellect contemplates on God, okay? And then it contemplates on the second intellect, and it contemplates on the first sphere or heaven. So one more time. The first intellect that came into manifestation contemplates first on God, the necessary being, then contemplates on intellect number 2, the second intellect, and contemplates on the first sphere and the first soul, which results in what? In the creation of the second intellect. The second intellect contemplates on the first intellect, then generates, sorry, I used contemplate there, that's and then generates the third intellect and generates the second sphere and the second soul. And it goes on. So therefore, the creation and the emanation of the essence of God through the manifestation of all that we know as the world of existence takes place in some ways. This is my imagination working with images, but it's based on Ibn Sina's thinking. There are similar patterns in other religions, religious traditions and philosophical traditions too, to which we will not go. Now, when this series continues all the way down to, way down at the bottom, we get to the 10th intellect. And it's the 10th intellect which goes, which then, yes, it does contemplate on the 9th intellect, but then it goes down this way. And I don't know what that is. Thank you. Okay. Now, it goes down to, now we are using the term sublunar beings, and this is a Ptolemaic concept of the universe we are talking about 1,000 years ago. So we know better, but we will accept the terms as they are. And from there it goes to humankind, and then from there it comes to where we are. So in other words, these realms of reality from God that is omnipresent, that's everywhere, but just for us to understand at some point, and it keeps coming down, down, all the way until it gets to us. And it's in the sublunar level that the materia prima is created, the earth, the dust from which our jism, our body is created. Now, our form, as I said, does not have primacy. It's not even secondary. Our primacy is in our consciousness, which is our act. The soul is just providing the energy. And what comes out of it is then the second part. So now, if you see, look at these big arrows here. If you were to write this in Quranic language, you would say, Inna lillahi. We came from God down. So what do we do now? Now we have to go back. We follow the next level. And the next level is that God creates us with a potentiality to go back and reunite with God. Why? Because God is beauty, but God is also love. And God loved the creation so much that from the moment God created, it called everything back Remember this contemplation part. It called everything back because it missed us. We miss each other, like our neighbor or someone else after a few days, a few months, whatever. It takes time for us. But God missed us at the very moment, and that's why, as the Quran says, God gave the command, Irji, come back to me. And we heard that command, God inviting us back unto itself, and we are going back. How do we go back? Remember, we went through all these, for lack of a better term, we went through all these filters, right? To come from the purity, the absolute purity that the divine is, to what we have become. Now, if we have to go back, we have to earn it, we have to deserve it, we have to purify, we have to cleanse, to qualify to be where we should be headed. If you're traveling to a different climate, you have to wear the right clothes, right? If you're going to a circle of scholars, you have to be prepared up here, okay? If you're going to dance and entertainment, at least you have to know how to shake your body a little bit, right? So wherever you are going, you have to be prepared. Now here, we are going to dance with the divine. Okay, and I'm mixing the metaphor just to make the point clear. Okay? Now, if you're going back to God, we have to become like God. And how do we become like God? With all the attributes that the Quran mentions. So the attributes of God are not there to introduce God to us, but so we can emulate them and become like it. So if God is Rahman, we have to become Rahman. If God is Wadud, love, we have to become love. We have to become all of those things. And how do we do that? God give us the potentiality down here at the bottom. It's this potentiality that will take us back there, and the whole recipe is written here in half Latin, half English, deliberately, so that we would be deserving to be in the presence of God. And this would be, in essence, a translation of Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi rajiun. We are going back there. But how you go back there could be an individual journey, and some people probably die without even bothering. We have different personalities, different interests, and not everyone is interested in God, especially these days. And I'm not talking about the Trump's presidency. What conclusion do we draw from this? The conclusion we draw is that even understanding the divine, or at least this one verse of the Quran that I keep repeating, can be understood as a matter of conviction, belief, or revelation, or it can be reasoned. And this is one of the ways that at least this genius of the 9th and 10th century, Ibn Sina, is doing his job and explaining to us that this is one way to look at it. Now, Ibn Sina's father was an Ismaili. And in the Ismaili tradition, remember we talked about the fall of Adam? For most of us, Adam falls here from the 10th level. For the Ismailis, God falls from the 3rd level. So how many levels does that leave? 7. So it takes 7 levels to go back there. So when you look at Sufi terminology, they often talk about the 7 seas, the 7 oceans, the 7 valleys. That magic number 7 is there because we have fallen down 7 steps. We have to go back 7 steps. And before that happens, you will be interrupted because time is up. Is that what the message was?
No, you still have time.
Okay. All right. So therefore, the logic of the application of the reformulation of the Greek philosophy are used in a better understanding of monotheistic concept that we read in the Quran and in forms in the Bible. And I think that if we can look at it this way, we understand that Islamic civilization didn't just become that overnight, but it took the hard work of great thinkers, such as Ibn Sina, that it raised the Muslim world to a higher level. Today's Muslims are more interested in chopping the heads rather than working on the ideas that could emanate from the heads. So let me stop here and see if you have any questions, and if you don't feel bad. Yes, Iman.
What are the differences between the different intellects? Like it goes from one intellect to the next intellect.
I didn't pay her, but that's the most relevant question for the discussion that I overlooked. God is understood in this way as the super intellect, aql kull. It's the totality of intellect. Quran, when it refers to God and uses the word aql in reference to God, it always uses it in a noun form, because the noun form doesn't change. God doesn't change. It is absolute. When it uses the word aql in reference to humans, it is used in a verb form, because in verb it changes. And so God is the total intellect, and as it goes through these stages, we become the partial intellect, aql juz'i. And it is that folly that we overlook, that when we humans say, I want to know God, we never question, like, wait a minute, do you have the ability? If we have come through these levels and our intellectual power has become so minute, how is it that we could understand God? There is just no way. Because our intellectual power, our partial intelligence, is only there for us to be functional and operate in this reality, in this physical reality. It is not good beyond that. Even here, it is not good enough. That's why several of you are wearing glasses, because you can't see well. And I'm sure some of you are wearing earpieces and all that. That's why we have microscopes and telescopes and all scopes to expand the scopes that our existing senses are incapable of understanding and detecting. And so this shows our incapabilities, in the sense that my beautiful cat that I left home this morning can smell 400 times better than I can. And sometimes when I put the food, she just looks around. She knows that there might be a coyote or something around. I have no idea. And yet I consider myself to be superior to the cat. An eagle's vision is 40 times stronger than the human. And that's why when it's in flight, not using the cruise control, it can spot a piece of corn, a grain of corn on the ground, and it can dive and get it right there. For me, that grain of corn is just in the middle of jungle somewhere. I have no idea. So even our senses are not the best. Okay, we don't have the best hearing, the best seeing, the best smelling, etc., etc. So what right do we have to use the limitations of these senses, and what do we want to find and see? God. And therefore, for me, again, we are going to hear the azan, which will start with the word. Exactly. And I think we betray that word more than anything else. Because if you understand Allahu Akbar, which means God is greater. Okay? If God is greater, then how dare we take the greatness of God and we put it in a tiny little box, which is the box of my imagination. If we perceive God through our perception and believe that that is God, In our word we say God is greater, in our perception we make God smaller.